welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm going to be probably talking about something massively out of date, but it's been a busy week, and just something that I saw earlier this week has sparked off some thoughts, and so this is actually the day of release that I'm recording this, because I've been kind of thinking about it, and I didn't have anything planned for this week's podcast, but I think this could be quite an interesting topic. So without further ado, let's get into kind of some of my thoughts on the topic of whether any car names and brands are almost too special, too kind of well thought of to revive, or if it is possible to do it well. And then obviously I'd love to hear some of your thoughts down in the comments on YouTube or over on the various social medias, as you guys have already been kind of sharing, and kind of let's start a bit of a discussion about this. So for context, if you haven't seen my posts on social media this week, I went to Greg's earlier this week and parked up in the car park, and for the first time in the flesh I saw the brand new Ford Capri on a 74 plate in the yellow that the promotion stuff was all done in. And if you've spent any time on the internet in kind of the last, 6-8 months ago, you will know that when that was released, it was almost kind of universally panned. The comments on the YouTubes, on the Instagram, anything that people kind of did about it were just so universally not very positive. And there was a lot of discussion around the idea that a Capri as a name has got a very specific styling cues, very specific expectations from the public. And it's interesting because the name Capri had obviously been used twice by Ford before, and there's lots of examples of car companies bringing back names that had existed before. But in this particular case, people were really angry about it and didn't feel like it fitted their expectations of a modern Ford Capri. And it kind of was one of those things where I kind of took note of it, I guess had a bit of a laugh about it, but then was like, okay, move on. But seeing it in person, I'd kind of almost forgotten that they existed and that they were going to exist. I was like, oh my gosh, what is that huge yellow thing? And then parked up kind of near it and was like, oh, it's the new Ford Capri. Completely forgot about it. Took some photos because I thought it was pretty interesting, and then put it up on Facebook and Instagram on the Passenger Seat Podcast's social media. And even now, people are still kind of quite angry about it, and I totally understand. And obviously the comparison of seeing kind of Peggy near it is quite interesting as well, and I got kind of a couple of angles as it drove off. And I have to say, like, I didn't expect this to be what it's ended up being, and credit to the guy that bought it. I mean, firstly, apologies, because he probably saw me taking the photos and was like, oh, someone's admiring my lovely yellow car. And to be fair, the colour yellow on it is a lovely shade of yellow. And I don't have, people buy whatever cars they like. There's cars that I probably hate more than that. But he bought it in the yellow of the promo and stuff, and totally cool. That's a choice. But yeah, he probably thought that I was admiring the car kind of thing. And I imagine there's people that take pictures of my car and have got stuff to say about it. But it just, the kind of continued discussion afterwards on those social media posts got me thinking about whether there are any car brands and names that feel too sacrilegious, and why this example has been kind of such a universal, I guess, for lack of a better term, ick from the car community. So if we think about what Capri means to people, I think most people would agree that the console Capris and the like 70s, 80s Capris, it was very much a sexy kind of affordable-ish sports car that was also quite usable. Like there was space in the back and stuff like that. And they had quite iconic styling. There was that kind of sloping, sporting shape to them. And arguably, some of those cues have translated to this modern design of the car. But you do wonder kind of if it was ever going to be possible to recreate the feel of those earlier cars when modern cars today demand so much kind of bulk and size and expectation. Because even if you look at our Kia Picanto next to the Morris Minor, which actually when I've taken that round to Ian Allen, the guy that did the restoration on Peggy, when I was going to check up on her and stuff like that, he joked that it's kind of the modern Morris Minor in the fact that it is a small family car that you've got kind of a bit of boot space, a 1 litre engine, and kind of 4 seats realistically, not really much more, and the back seats are really for short people, children, or people that are going to cope with not having huge amounts of legroom. Well, arguably, I think we have more legroom in Peggy than we do in the Kia, but there is that kind of comparison. And if you park Peggy next to the Kia, even beside that, she looks small because there's not necessarily all the safety features. There's not kind of the bulking, there's of the door panels and stuff like that. Although it is much closer, I would say, than the size of a Capri from the 70s or 80s next to the Capri that we see on Ford's website today. So getting that kind of sleekness might have been more doable than it was in that design, but equally I guess they were looking for something that was going to sell to more people, because it's like the every person's brand. And so making it a car like that might not bring in a lot of their typical market and who they were looking for it to be, at which point, why bring back the name? If you look at examples of other brands bringing back names, if you look at when the Fiat 500 came back, if you look at when the Mini came back, if you look at when the Beetle came back, there was a clear kind of lineage and similarities between the two vehicles that the public were seeing, and there was greater similarities in size, in expectation, in the kind of styling being very clearly referenced much more directly than I think we've seen with this example. I was thinking about it, and I would argue that the leap between the two Capris here is much more similar to if you got kind of a Fiat 500 vintage classic edition and maybe like the Fiat 500L or X, depending on kind of which one you're more familiar with. If Fiat had gone from this is the historic version to the Fiat 500 X or L that we see today, I don't know if they even still sell those, but there's not really the same. There's some elements of styling cues that I think are similar. It's quite a kind of cutesy looking car, and the roof lines and stuff kind of carry over, but realistically it is vastly different. And kind of, if there wasn't that modern Fiat 500 in the middle, same with kind of the much bigger Minis that you can get now, I can't remember the names of them, but if there hadn't been the regular Mini recreation in the middle, there would have been, I think, a similar kind of outrage. So using that name hasn't necessarily worked well for what people are envisioning a modern Capri to perhaps look like. And I started thinking about, well, is there cars that at this point, because of how the electric motors have to go in, because of all of these things that have drastically changed the design of cars, it would just be impossible to bring back. And I was like, how could you do these things accurately? And one thing that I think goes around on, like, at least the Morris Minor groups is this AI recreation of the 2024, then it was the 2025 Morris Minor that's supposedly coming out from some Chinese branded electric car company. And, oh, this is for styling and stuff like that. And there's always all these discussions about, oh, this bit kind of fits with what they're looking at, but this bit feels really not like it's matching the expectations of what a modern Morris Minor would look like. And I think there is potential, but equally, is there a need? Because realistically, the Mini kind of countrymen and clubmans fill a lot of the kind of traveller expectations, and I'm not so sure about the current design of Mini, but the Minis that have come before definitely filled that similar hole to what a Morris Minor would have done in 2025. So what was the need, and would people ever really have been happy? Because a lot of the styling cues that were so typical and evocative of the design of the Morris Minor, you don't necessarily see in modern cars, whereas I think the lines of a Mini are much more similar to what we're seeing in car design of modern cars these days, in terms of quite a flat front and a little bit kind of boxy, but you can kind of smooth over the edges and make it a little bit more rounded and friendly, whereas the roundness of a Morris Minor feels quite intentional, and I don't think that's necessarily the way that roundness works in modern car designs that you see kind of out and about on the road. I'm literally sat here watching kind of cars go past, and you can kind of, sometimes it's a struggle to work out what they are, because it's just kind of this vaguely aerodynamic curve rather than an intentional styling choice that I feel that the Morris Minor really was, in terms of it making a big step away from what had come before. So the Morris Minor might be one of those ones that is quite tricky to bring back in a way that feels appropriate to the public's expectations these days. But again, is there a need for it? Or is there a need nowadays for cars that are different and have different names? Trading on nostalgia isn't easy. It doesn't always work, as the Capri aspect has kind of seen. And when the people who love Morris Minors most likely own a Morris Minor, what would be their need to buy a modern counterpart? Nobody who is buying the modern counterpart is going to necessarily make the choice on an existing name that they're familiar with at this point. I don't feel like people are going to go, oh, I really wanted a whatever as a kid and I didn't get one. I haven't been able to get one now as an adult in terms of the exact same thing that I loved as a kid. So what I'm going to do is buy this modern one, because realistically the modern ones are going to be way more expensive than buying the actual thing that you were nostalgic for in most cases, and aren't going to give you the same feeling that you probably fell in love with as a kid in a lot of cases. You're buying a car that you are looking for modern expectations, and therefore a name isn't necessarily going to persuade you to buy that more than something else. Equally, I think there's loads of, like, we wouldn't expect to see a Model T come back. We wouldn't expect to see, I don't know, loads of pre-war names like a Ruby or whatever, because also those names, I think Ford got quite lucky in the fact that the term Capri fits in with a lot of typical names now, but a lot of historic names wouldn't necessarily suit what people are used to seeing cars named. But equally, I think it meant that they fell into this kind of trap of it not really working. Another example, I would guess, of bringing names back and interestingly having a different result is kind of Rolls-Royces, particularly in the fact that the Phantoms and things like that have come back in a modern form, but there was kind of almost 100 odd years between the first ones and the next ones, and I feel like they were able to do some particular kind of branding and expectation work within the people that are buying it to make it fit with what they were expecting, but also there's a different market there in terms of the prestige attached to a name rather than the fantasy attached to a name that you might see with kind of a retro sports car or I mean, imagine bringing back a Scimitar as a car, like under a new name. Like it's an expectation, it's a fantasy, rather than it being kind of a name of prestige necessarily. And so that feels like a very different kind of expected reaction from the audience that you are pitching it to. So that's kind of some of my thoughts on it all. I would be interested to hear, is there a car that the name feels too important, too specialist for you to bring back in the modern world? Like, doesn't matter if the kind of parent make exists anymore. Is there something that you're like, if somebody reused that name, it would feel kind of sacrilegious almost, and inappropriate, and unless it was kind of really heavily taking the style direction, or even if that was the case and you were like, actually no, even if they brought back this car as a new car, there's no way that I would pick that over the historic. Now I understand that you're listening to a classic car podcast here, so there is going to be some bias in the audience. A lot of you are going to probably pick the classic over now, but things like if Citroën brought back a BX, there's talk of Citroën bringing back the 2CV, and I've seen the kind of images around that, and you can see that they've directly pulled from the original material, and so that feels like it might appeal. And equally, what have they really got in their lineup at the moment that fits exactly what the 2CV was doing all those years ago? So it's filling a gap, and it's the same gap that was there when they kind of brought it in, I feel. But yeah, is there anything that you would never buy regardless if they brought it back, and you'd rather buy the vintage version? Is there something that if they brought the name back you might be tempted by regardless of styling? Do you think there's some sort of secret recipe as to how to bring back a car name and the public kind of fall in love with it the same way they did 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago? I'd love to hear your thoughts and really have an interesting discussion about this. And thank you ever so much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.